The dust swirled around Sarah's bare feet as she stumbled through the ranch gate, her wedding dress torn and muddied beyond recognition. Behind her, cruel laughter echoed from the bunkhouse where the ranch hands had gathered to witness her humiliation. What they didn't know was that in 3 days she'd ride back into Millbrook beside the one man they all feared and respected, the legendary gunslinger who'd chosen her over every saloon girl in 3 counties. This is the story of how a broken woman became the most powerful lady in the territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Broken Arrow Ranch as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her flour sack dress for the 100th time. The fabric, patched and repatched, barely held together at the seams. She'd sewn it herself from grain sacks her father had saved, dyeing it with berry juice to give it some semblance of color. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. At 19, Sarah had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age. Her father's death the previous winter had left her with nothing but debts and a reputation as the poorest girl in Millbrook County. The small homestead they'd called home had been sold to pay creditors, leaving Sarah to find work wherever she could. The Broken Arrow Ranch, owned by the wealthy Thornton family, had been her salvation, or so she'd thought. Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, a stern woman with silver hair pulled back in a perpetual bun, had hired Sarah as a seamstress and general helper. The pay was meager, barely enough to rent a tiny room above Murphy's general store in town, but it kept her fed and clothed. What Sarah hadn't anticipated was the cruelty of the ranch hands, Buck Morrison. The ranch foreman was a mountain of a man with calloused hands and a permanent sneer. He'd taken an immediate dislike to Sarah, viewing her as nothing more than charity case cluttering up the ranch. His crew, a motley collection of drifters and hard men, followed his lead without question. There was Pete Hawkins, a gap-toothed man who spat tobacco juice with alarming accuracy. Jimmy Sullivan, barely 18 himself, but already hardened by years of rough living. Tom Bradley, whose scarred face told stories of barroom brawls and cattle drives gone wrong. And Jake Reynolds, whose wandering eyes and crude comments made Sarah's skin crawl. Every morning, Sarah would arrive at the ranch before dawn to begin her duties. She mended clothes, prepared meals for the hands, and helped Mrs. Thornton with household tasks. And every morning, the harassment would begin anew. "Look what the wind blew in," Buck would announce as Sarah walked past the bunkhouse. Miss High and Mighty in her fancy potato sack dress, the others would join in with their own cruel observations. Pete would make exaggerated bowing gestures, calling her Your Majesty, in a voice dripping with sarcasm. Jimmy would whistle off-key versions of wedding marches, suggesting she was dressed for a ceremony no man would ever want to attend. Sarah learned to keep her head down and her mouth shut. She needed this job, needed the few dollars it provided each week. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The worst of it came on washing days. Every Tuesday and Friday, Sarah would haul baskets of dirty clothes to the creek that ran behind the main house. The ranch hands would often find excuses to water their horses nearby, positioning themselves where they could watch her work. "Reckon she's washing that dress of hers in the same water as our shirts?" Jake would say loud enough for her to hear. "Might catch whatever makes a person that poor. Poverty ain't catching," Tom would reply with a harsh laugh. "But stupidity sure is. Look at her, thinking she belongs here among decent folk." Sarah would scrub harder at the stains, her knuckles bleeding from the rough washboard, tears mixing with the creek water. But she never gave them the satisfaction of seeing her cry openly. Mrs. Thornton seemed oblivious to the harassment, or perhaps she simply chose to ignore it. She was kind enough to Sarah in their direct interactions, even complimentary about her needlework skills. But she was also a woman of her social station who didn't concern herself with the dynamics between her employees. The Thornton family lived in a different world from Sarah's daily reality. Their son, Marcus, was away at college back east. Their daughter, Victoria, spent her days planning social events and shopping trips to Kansas City. They had visiting rooms Sarah was never allowed to enter, china she was forbidden to touch, and books she could only dust but never read. One particularly hot July afternoon, Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see a stranger riding toward the main house, a man unlike anyone she'd seen in Millbrook County. He sat tall in his saddle, wearing a black hat pulled low over his eyes. His clothes were well made, but travel-worn, and a gun belt hung low on his hips with the casual confidence of someone who knew how to use it. The horse he rode was a magnificent black stallion that seemed to dance rather than walk. Most striking were his hands. Even from a distance, Sarah could see they were clean and steady, not rough and scarred like the ranch hands. These were the hands of a man who made his living with precision rather than brute force. Buck Morrison had noticed the stranger too. The foreman and his crew emerged from the barn, their usual swagger replaced by wariness. Sarah had never seen Buck look uncertain about anything, but something about this newcomer had changed his demeanor entirely. "Afternoon," the stranger called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Name's Cole Henderson. I'm looking for Mrs. Thornton. She's in the house," Buck replied, his tone unusually respectful. "You expected?" "She wrote me a letter," Henderson replied, dismounting with fluid grace. "About some trouble she's been having," Sarah's breath caught. She'd heard whispers about Mrs. Thornton's concerns, cattle going missing, fences cut in the night, supplies vanishing from the storehouse. The local sheriff had proven useless, claiming there wasn't enough evidence to investigate properly. Apparently, Mrs. Thornton had decided to hire private help. As Henderson walked toward the house, his gaze swept across the yard. For just a moment, his eyes met Sarah's. He touched the brim of his hat in a small gesture of acknowledgement before continuing on his way. That brief moment sent an unexpected warmth through Sarah's chest. When was the last time any man had shown her such simple courtesy? She couldn't remember. The ranch hands, meanwhile, had gathered in a tight cluster near the barn, their voices low but urgent. "You know who that is?" Pete whispered, his usual bravado completely absent. "Cole Henderson," Jimmy replied, and there was genuine fear in his voice. "Heard tell he cleaned out the Murphy gang down in Texas. All 6 of them in broad daylight. I heard he faced down Black Pete Morrison up in Colorado," Tom added. "Shot him dead before Pete could clear leather." Buck spat into the dust, but Sarah noticed his hand trembling slightly. "Don't matter who he is. He's just passing through." But Sarah could see in their faces that it mattered very much. For the first time since she'd started working at the ranch, the men who tormented her daily looked genuinely afraid. Henderson spent nearly an hour in the house with Mrs. Thornton. When he emerged, he shook hands with the lady of the house and mounted his horse. As he rode past the group of ranch hands, he nodded politely, but Sarah noticed his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Gentlemen," he said simply, and rode away. The effect on the ranch hands was immediate and profound. For the rest of that day, they spoke in hushed tones and kept looking over their shoulders. Buck's usual stream of orders became terse commands, and the cruel banter that normally filled the air was replaced by nervous silence. Sarah found herself thinking about the stranger long after he'd disappeared down the dusty road. There had been something in his brief acknowledgement of her, a recognition of her as a person rather than an object of ridicule. It was such a small thing, but in her world of daily humiliation, it felt revolutionary. That evening, as she walked back to town, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have someone look at her with respect instead of contempt. The fantasy was dangerous, she knew. Men like Cole Henderson didn't take notice of women like her, not in any meaningful way. But for a few precious minutes she let herself dream. The next morning brought a return to routine. Buck and his crew seemed to have shaken off their nervousness from the previous day, and the familiar pattern of harassment resumed. If anything, they seemed more determined than usual to assert their dominance. "Did you see the way our little princess was staring at that gunfighter yesterday?" Jake sneered as Sarah walked past with a basket of mending. Probably thinks a man like that would give her the time of day. Hell, Pete laughed. She probably thinks that flour sack she's wearing is a ball gown. Delusional little thing. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. She'd learned not to react, not to give them additional ammunition for their cruelty. But something had shifted inside her during that brief encounter with Henderson. A tiny spark of defiance had been lit, and though she tried to suppress it, it refused to be completely extinguished. The harassment continued throughout the morning, reaching a crescendo when Sarah accidentally knocked over a water bucket while filling the horse's trough. The bucket clanged against the metal sides, spilling water across the packed dirt. Jesus Christ! Buck roared, striding over with fury written across his face. Can't you do anything right, you worthless little... He grabbed Sarah's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. She cried out in pain, dropping the bucket entirely. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "It was an accident. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Accident?" Buck's grip tightened. "You're the accident. Coming here every day, cluttering up the place with your poverty and your pathetic excuses for clothes." The other ranch hands had gathered around, their faces eager with anticipation of Sarah's humiliation. This was entertainment for them, a break in the monotony of ranch work. "Maybe we should teach her some manners," Jake suggested, his eyes glittering with malice. "Show her what happens to girls who don't know their place." Sarah's heart pounded with genuine fear. These men were capable of real violence. She'd seen the scars they wore, heard their stories of bar fights and range wars. And there was no one to help her. Mrs. Thornton was in town for the day, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. "Please," she whispered, hating the weakness in her own voice. "I'll be more careful. I promise." Buck's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Oh, you'll be careful, all right. Because if you're not, because if she's not, what?" The voice came from behind the group of ranch hands, cold and deadly calm. Sarah looked up to see Cole Henderson standing 20 feet away, his hand resting lightly on his gun. The transformation in the ranch hands was instantaneous. Buck released Sarah's arm as if he'd been burned, stepping back with his hands raised slightly. The others scattered like leaves in the wind, suddenly finding urgent tasks that required their immediate attention. "Just having a conversation with the girl," Buck stammered. His earlier authority completely evaporated. "No harm intended." Henderson's cold gaze swept over the scene. Sarah's tear-stained face, the bruises already forming on her arm, the overturned bucket. His expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "It looked more like a conversation from where I was standing," he said quietly. "Looked like a grown man putting his hands on a young lady who couldn't defend herself." "Now see here," Buck began. But Henderson cut him off with a slight movement of his hand toward his gun. "I don't think I will see here," Henderson replied. "What I think is that you and your boys have work to do somewhere else, immediately." The ranch hands didn't need to be told twice. They dispersed with remarkable speed, leaving Sarah and Henderson alone by the water trough. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah stood frozen, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. No one had ever defended her before, not since her father died. Henderson approached slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Are you hurt?" Sarah looked down at her arm, where Buck's grip had left angry red marks. "It's nothing," she said automatically, the response of someone accustomed to minimizing her own pain. "It's not nothing," Henderson said firmly. "A man who puts his hands on a woman in anger is lower than a snake." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she'd shed so many times before. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of something she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she whispered. Henderson nodded once, then reached down to right the overturned bucket. "What's your name?" Sarah Mitchell." "Well, Miss Mitchell, I have a feeling those men won't be bothering you again any time soon." As he spoke, Sarah became aware that they were being watched. Through windows and around corners, ranch hands peered out with expressions of awe and fear. Word would spread quickly. Cole Henderson had taken up for the poor seamstress girl. The implications of that simple act would ripple through the community like stones thrown in still water. But Sarah didn't care about implications or consequences. For the first time in months, she felt like a human being worthy of basic dignity and respect. And it was all because of the quiet man standing beside her, whose simple presence had transformed her world. Word of Henderson's intervention spread through Millbrook County faster than wildfire. By sunset, every person within a 20-mile radius knew that the famous gunslinger had taken up for Sarah Mitchell against Buck Morrison and his crew. The story grew with each telling, as stories do in small towns where entertainment is scarce and gossip is currency. At Murphy's General Store, where Sarah rented her cramped room upstairs, old Mrs. Murphy could barely contain her excitement as she related the tale to anyone who would listen. Right there in broad daylight, he faced down all 5 of them, she exclaimed to Martha Wells, the blacksmith's wife. Poor little Sarah, standing there with tears in her eyes, and that Henderson fellow just appeared like an avenging angel. Martha shook her head in amazement. I always knew those ranch hands were no good. The way they carry on in town on Saturday nights, drinking and carousing like they own the place. Well, they'll think twice before laying a hand on that girl again, Mrs. Murphy declared with satisfaction. Man like Cole Henderson doesn't make idle threats. Sarah heard every word from her position at the top of the stairs. She'd returned to town in a daze, her mind reeling from the afternoon's events. The bruises on her arm were already darkening, but they seemed insignificant compared to the profound shift she felt in her circumstances. For the first time in months, she'd walked down Main Street without having to endure catcalls from the ranch hands, who often lounged outside the saloon. They were nowhere to be seen, having apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. That evening, as Sarah sat in her tiny room, mending a tear in one of Mrs. Thornton's tablecloths, she found her thoughts returning obsessively to Henderson, the way he'd stood so calmly in the face of 5 hostile men, the quiet authority in his voice when he'd spoken, the genuine concern in his eyes when he'd asked if she was hurt. She'd known men like her father, good men who worked hard and treated others with basic decency. But she'd never known a man who commanded respect through sheer presence alone. Henderson didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. His reputation preceded him, and that reputation was enough to humble men who had never shown humility in their lives. The next morning brought unexpected developments. Sarah arrived at the ranch to find Mrs. Thornton waiting for her with an unusual expression on her face, something between sympathy and calculation. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Thornton began, her tone carefully modulated. "I heard about yesterday's incident." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Of course, Mrs. Thornton had heard. In a community this small, such news would reach the main house before the dust had settled. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "I know, I shouldn't have." "You shouldn't have what?" Mrs. Thornton interrupted. "Been assaulted by my employees." "Sarah, you have nothing to apologize for." The kindness in her employer's voice caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected recriminations, perhaps even dismissal. Instead, Mrs. Thornton seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare. "I've decided to make some changes around here," Mrs. Thornton continued. "First, you'll no longer be doing any work that requires you to be near the bunkhouse unaccompanied. Second, I'm giving you a raise, 50 cents more per week." Sarah's eyes widened. 50 cents was significant money for someone in her position. "Thank you, ma'am. That's very generous. It's overdue," Mrs. Thornton replied firmly. "And Sarah, if any of the hands give you trouble, any trouble at all, you come directly to me. Is that understood?" Sarah nodded, overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. It seemed that Henderson's intervention had done more than simply stop one incident of harassment. It had fundamentally altered her standing at the ranch. Throughout the morning, Sarah noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. The ranch hands went about their duties with unusual focus, avoiding the house entirely unless their work specifically required them to be there. When they did encounter Sarah, they tipped their hats politely and muttered respectful greetings. Buck Morrison was conspicuously absent. According to whispered conversations Sarah overheard, he'd taken a crew out to check on cattle in the far pastures, work that would keep them away from the main house for several days. Around noon, as Sarah was hanging wash on the line, she heard the sound of approaching hooves. Her heart rate quickened as she recognized the black stallion and its rider. Henderson was returning to the ranch. He dismounted near the main house and spent another hour in conference with Mrs. Thornton. When he emerged this time, however, he didn't immediately ride away. Instead, he walked across the yard toward where Sarah was working. "Miss Mitchell," he said, touching his hat brim in greeting. "Mr. Henderson." Sarah's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Up close, in full daylight, he was even more imposing than she'd remembered. Not because of his size, he was tall but not unusually so, but because of the contained energy that seemed to radiate from him. This was a man accustomed to life and death situations, and it showed in every controlled movement. "I wanted to check on you," he said simply. "Make sure there are no further difficulties." "No, sir. Everyone's been very respectful today." Henderson nodded, but his eyes were scanning the area around them, taking in details with the practiced vigilance of a man who'd survived in dangerous professions. "Mrs. Thornton tells me you do beautiful needlework." Sarah blinked in surprise. Of all the topics she might have expected him to raise, her sewing skills wouldn't have made the list. "I will do my best, sir. She showed me some of your embroidery work. Said you taught yourself from looking at pictures in ladies' magazines." "My mother had some old patterns," Sarah explained, wondering where this conversation was leading. "I practiced on scraps until I got the hang of it." Henderson was quiet for a moment, and Sarah had the strange sensation that he was seeing far more than her current circumstances. It was as if he could look past the patched dress and worn shoes to glimpse the person she might have been under different conditions. "There's going to be a social dance in town next Saturday," he said finally. "At the church hall. Mrs. Thornton mentioned it, said most of the respectable families would be attending." Sarah's heart sank. She knew about the dance, had seen the notices posted around town, but such events weren't for people like her. She had no appropriate dress to wear, no social connections to ease her entry into polite society. The monthly dances were occasions for the established families to see and be seen, for young people of good breeding to meet potential spouses. "Yes, sir. I've heard about it. You should go," Henderson said, his tone matter of fact. Sarah stared at him in astonishment. I don't think. People like me don't usually." "People like what?" There was a slight edge to his voice now, the same tone she'd heard when he'd confronted Buck Morrison. "Poor people," Sarah said quietly, the words stinging even as she spoke them. "I don't have the right kind of dress, and I don't really know how to dance properly, and those are problems with solutions," Henderson interrupted. "Not permanent obstacles." Before Sarah could respond, he'd touched his hat brim again and was walking back toward his horse. She watched in bewilderment as he mounted and rode away, leaving her with more questions than answers. That afternoon brought another surprise. Mrs. Thornton approached Sarah with a request that seemed to come from nowhere. "Sarah, I have a favor to ask. My daughter Victoria is attending a wedding in Kansas City next month, and she needs some alterations done to her traveling dress. I was hoping you might take a look at it." Sarah followed Mrs. Thornton into the main house, through rooms she'd only glimpsed while dusting. The Thornton home was a monument to prosperity. Thick carpets, polished furniture, oil paintings in gilt frames. Sarah felt acutely conscious of her own shabby appearance in such surroundings. Victoria's room was a testament to privilege. Dresses hung in a wardrobe that was larger than Sarah's entire living space. The bed was draped in silk, and the vanity table held more cosmetics and hair ornaments than Sarah had seen in her entire life. "Here's the dress," Mrs. Thornton said, lifting a creation of blue silk and Belgian lace from the wardrobe. Victoria says it's too long and the waist needs to be taken in slightly. Sarah examined the garment with professional interest, running her fingers over the exquisite fabric and intricate beadwork. This dress cost more than she earned in a year. I can certainly fix the length and adjust the waist, she said. It's beautiful work, thank you. And Sarah? Mrs. Thornton paused at the doorway. Take your time with it. Victoria won't need it for several weeks. As Sarah worked on the alterations over the next few days, she found herself thinking constantly about Henderson's words. Those are problems with solutions, he'd said. But what solutions could possibly exist for someone in her circumstances? The answer came from an unexpected source. On Thursday afternoon, as Sarah was putting the finishing touches on Victoria's dress, Mrs. Thornton appeared with another garment draped over her arm. I found this in the back of Victoria's wardrobe, she said casually. Something she wore a few years ago but has outgrown. It seems a shame to let it go to waste. Sarah looked at the dress and felt her breath catch. It was simpler than Victoria's traveling dress, but no less elegant. Forest green wool with subtle embroidery around the neckline and sleeves. The style was modest enough to be appropriate for someone of Sarah's station, but the quality of the fabric and construction made it undeniably beautiful. I thought perhaps you might find a use for it, Mrs. Thornton continued, her tone carefully neutral. Consider it part of your wages. Sarah understood immediately. This was Mrs. Thornton's way of ensuring she had something suitable to wear to the church dance. The gesture was so thoughtful, so delicately handled, that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. This is incredibly kind. Nonsense. It's practical. Can't have my best seamstress looking shabby at community events. That evening, Sarah tried on the dress in her small room above the general store. The mirror was cracked and cloudy, but even in its distorted reflection, she could see the transformation. The dress fit perfectly, the rich color complementing her dark hair and fair skin in a way that made her look like a different person entirely. For the first time in her life, Sarah Mitchell looked like a lady. The next day brought news that set the entire county buzzing with excitement. Henderson had taken rooms at the Millbrook Hotel, apparently intending to stay in the area indefinitely. More surprising still, he'd been seen talking to various businessmen around town, asking questions about property values and investment opportunities. You think he's planning to settle here permanently? Asked Joe Patterson, the hotel proprietor, as he served breakfast to a dining room full of eager listeners. Why else would a man like that be asking about buying land? Replied Dr. Whitman, the town's physician. The question is, what's keeping him here? Job's done, from what I hear. Mrs. Thornton's troubles with rustlers dried up the minute he showed his face. Sarah heard these conversations during her weekly trip to town for supplies, and each new detail sent her thoughts spinning in directions she hardly dared explore. Could it be possible that Henderson's interest in the community had something to do with her? The idea seemed too fantastic to believe. Yet the timing of his decision was certainly curious. Saturday arrived with perfect autumn weather, clear skies and crisp air that promised an evening ideal for dancing. Sarah spent the afternoon preparing for the event with more care than she'd ever lavished on her appearance. She washed her hair with lavender soap Mrs. Murphy had given her, arranged it in a style she'd seen in one of Victoria's magazines, and carefully pressed the green dress. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through her small window, Sarah looked at herself in the cracked mirror one final time. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, confident, elegant, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with expensive cosmetics or elaborate styling. She was, she realized, ready to enter a new phase of her life. The church hall was already filled with music and laughter when Sarah arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters, cast warm light over the assembled crowd, and the local musicians had tuned their instruments to perfection. She recognized most of the faces. Families she'd served at the ranch, merchants she'd bought supplies from, young men who'd ignored her existence until now. But tonight was different. Tonight, heads turned as she entered. Conversations paused mid-sentence. She heard whispered comments of appreciation and surprise as people recognized the transformed seamstress from the Broken Arrow Ranch. And across the crowded hall, standing beside the refreshment table with Mrs. Thornton and several other prominent citizens, was Cole Henderson. He was dressed in a black suit that fit him perfectly, his dark hair neatly combed, but he still carried himself with that characteristic alertness that marked him as dangerous. When their eyes met across the room, he smiled, the first time Sarah had seen that expression on his face. It transformed his entire appearance, making him seem younger and infinitely more approachable. He began walking toward her, and Sarah felt every person in the hall watching their interaction. The poor seamstress and the famous gunslinger, the rejected outcast and the most eligible man in 3 counties. "Miss Mitchell," Henderson said when he reached her, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby listeners to hear clearly. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" The hall fell completely silent. Every eye was fixed on Sarah as she looked up into Henderson's face, seeing there not pity or charity, but genuine interest and respect. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd be delighted." As Henderson led her onto the dance floor, Sarah was dimly aware of the sensation they were creating. But all her attention was focused on the man beside her, on the strength of his arm around her waist, on the way he guided her through the steps with perfect confidence. "You look beautiful tonight," he murmured as they moved together to the music. "Thank you," Sarah replied, marveling at how natural this felt. "I have to admit, I never imagined myself dancing with someone like you." "Someone like what?" "Someone famous, someone important." Henderson's expression grew serious. "Fame is just noise, Sarah, and importance isn't measured by how many people know your name. It's measured by how you treat the people who can't do anything for you in return." As the dance ended and applause filled the hall, Sarah realized that everything in her life had changed. The ranch hands who had tormented her were nowhere to be seen, but their absence spoke volumes. Word had undoubtedly reached them that Cole Henderson was not only protecting her but courting her. The evening continued in a blur of introductions, conversations, and invitations. People who had previously overlooked Sarah's existence suddenly wanted to know everything about her. Families who had never acknowledged her presence were now treating her as if she were someone of consequence. But through it all, Henderson remained at her side, his presence both shield and proclamation. He was making a statement to the entire community. Sarah Mitchell was under his protection, and anyone who wished to remain on his good side would treat her accordingly. As the dance wound down and couples began making their farewells, Henderson offered to escort Sarah home. They walked slowly through the quiet streets of Millbrook, neither wanting the evening to end. "Tomorrow's Sunday," Henderson said as they paused outside Murphy's General Store. "I was hoping you might join me for dinner after church service." Sarah felt her heart race. "At the hotel? If that would be agreeable to you, it would be more than agreeable. It would be the final piece of her transformation from outcast to lady. Dining publicly with Cole Henderson would establish her social position beyond any possible doubt." "Yes," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." Henderson smiled again, that transformative expression that made him seem like an entirely different person. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Mitchell." As Sarah climbed the stairs to her room, she knew that her old life was officially over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new possibilities, and new dangers. But tonight, for the first time in her adult life, she felt truly hopeful about the future. The ranch hand's mockery seemed like a distant memory now. In 3 days, she would indeed ride beside the cowboy they all feared and respected. But the journey to that moment was proving to be far more complex and meaningful than simple revenge. It was proving to be the story of a woman discovering her own worth. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden autumn light that made even the dusty streets of Millbrook look picturesque. Sarah stood before her small mirror, adjusting the blue dress Mrs. Murphy had lent her for church, a simple but well-made garment that complemented her newfound confidence. The transformation of the past week still felt surreal. Just 7 days ago, she'd been the object of daily ridicule. Now she was preparing for dinner with the most talked-about man in 3 counties. The walk to church provided the first real test of her new social standing. As Sarah made her way down Main Street, she encountered neighbors and acquaintances who had previously treated her with indifference or barely concealed disdain. Their reactions now ranged from grudging respect to eager friendliness. "Morning, Miss Mitchell," called out Henry Barnes, the bank clerk who had never so much as nodded to her before. "Lovely day for services, isn't it?" "Good morning, Mr. Barnes," Sarah replied with a polite smile, marveling at how differently people behaved when they perceived her as being under powerful protection. At the church, the dynamic was even more pronounced. Families who had occupied the same pews for generations suddenly had room for one more. Invitations to sit with established households came from multiple directions, each offering Sarah a chance to elevate her social position. She chose to sit with the Whitman family. The doctor and his wife were known for their genuine kindness rather than their social climbing. As she settled into the pew, Sarah noticed Henderson entering the church alone. He wore a dark suit that emphasized his natural authority, and every head in the building turned to track his movement. Their eyes met across the congregation, and Henderson nodded slightly before taking a seat near the back. The message was clear to everyone present. They were together, but he was allowing her to establish her own social connections rather than overwhelming the situation with his presence. Reverend Patterson's sermon focused on the parable of the Good Samaritan, and Sarah couldn't help but see parallels to her own recent experience. Henderson had been her unlikely savior, stopping to help when others had passed by or actively participated in her suffering. After the service, the usual socializing on the church steps took on new dimensions. Conversations that would normally have excluded Sarah now seemed to orbit around her. Matrons, who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible, now sought her opinions on various community matters. "Miss Mitchell," called out Patricia Wells, "the banker's wife, I heard you're quite skilled with a needle. Perhaps you'd consider helping with the quilting circle. We're making blankets for the winter charity drive." Such invitations had never come her way before. Sarah accepted graciously, understanding that her participation would cement her place in the community's social fabric. But she also recognized the calculated nature of these overtures. People were hedging their bets, ensuring they remained on good terms with someone who clearly had powerful connections. Henderson approached as the crowd began to disperse. "Ready for that dinner?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Sarah replied, acutely aware that their public departure together would be the main topic of conversation for the rest of the day. The Millbrook Hotel's dining room was the finest restaurant in the county, with white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and china that rivaled anything in the Thornton household. Sarah had never eaten in such elegant surroundings, but Henderson's calm presence helped steady her nerves. "Order whatever appeals to you," Henderson said as they perused the menu. "The beef here is excellent, and I'm told the apple pie is legendary." Over the course of the meal, Sarah learned more about her mysterious protector. Henderson had been born in Missouri, the son of a circuit judge who died when Cole was 16. He'd spent his early years working various jobs: ranch hand, deputy sheriff, Army scout, before his skill with a gun earned him a reputation that followed him wherever he went. "It's not a life I'd recommend," he said thoughtfully as he cut into his steak. "Living by your reputation means you're always one mistake away from losing everything. But it's taught me to recognize quality when I see it." "Quality?" Sarah asked, uncertain of his meaning. "Character, integrity, the ability to maintain dignity under difficult circumstances." Henderson's blue eyes met hers steadily. "You've shown more grace under pressure than most men I've known." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't know about that. Most days, I felt like I was barely holding myself together." "That's exactly what I mean." You kept working, kept your head up, never let them break your spirit. That takes real strength. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Marcus Thornton, Mrs. Thornton's son, had returned from college and was making his rounds through town. He was a pleasant-looking young man, with his mother's sharp intelligence but none of her social grace. "Mr. Henderson," Marcus said, approaching their table with obvious curiosity. "Mother told me you were in town. And Miss Mitchell, what a pleasant surprise to see you here." Sarah could read the calculation behind Marcus's friendly demeanor. He was trying to understand the dynamic between her and Henderson, perhaps wondering if this association might affect his family's business relationship with the gunslinger. "Join us for coffee?" Henderson offered politely, though Sarah sensed he would have preferred to continue their private conversation. Marcus accepted, settling into a chair with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. "I have to say, the stories about your intervention at the ranch have reached even Kansas City. Quite the talk of the territory." "Stories have a way of growing in the telling," Henderson replied neutrally. "Perhaps, but Mother was quite impressed. Said you resolved her rustling problem without firing a single shot." Sarah listened to this exchange with growing understanding. Henderson's reputation was so formidable that his mere presence had been enough to solve Mrs. Thornton's troubles. No wonder the ranch hands had been so thoroughly cowed by his intervention on her behalf. Sometimes the threat of action is more effective than action itself, Henderson observed. "Especially when dealing with men who understand consequences." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Mother also mentioned you've been asking about property in the area. Planning to settle in Millbrook County?" "Considering it," Henderson replied. "I'm getting too old to spend my life on horseback. Time to think about putting down roots somewhere." This revelation sent Sarah's thoughts spinning. If Henderson was seriously considering staying in the area, what did that mean for their developing relationship? And what did it mean for her future? After Marcus departed, Henderson and Sarah walked through the quiet Sunday streets of Millbrook. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, and most of the town's residents were enjoying family dinners or afternoon naps. "Marcus seemed surprised to see us together," Sarah observed. Henderson smiled slightly. "Marcus is a good kid, but he's never had to navigate the real world. Everything's been handed to him on a silver platter. He can't quite figure out why a man like me would be interested in a woman like you." "And why are you?" Sarah asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Henderson stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Because you're genuine. In my line of work, I meet a lot of people who pretend to be something they're not. You're exactly who you appear to be. No masks, no deception. That's rarer than you might think." They resumed walking, and Sarah found herself thinking about the other women Henderson must have encountered in his travels. Saloon girls who offered temporary companionship. Society ladies who might see him as an exciting diversion from their sheltered lives. Wealthy widows who could provide comfort and security. "What about you?" Henderson asked, breaking into her thoughts. "What do you want from life?" It was a question no one had ever asked her before. Sarah's entire existence had been focused on survival, finding work, paying rent, getting enough to eat. Dreams and desires had been luxuries she couldn't afford. "I used to want stability," she said slowly. "A place where I belonged, people who valued me. Now, I'm not sure. This week has shown me possibilities I never imagined." "Such as?" Sarah considered her words carefully. "The chance to be seen as more than just a charity case. The opportunity to contribute something meaningful to a community. Maybe even—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express thoughts that were still forming. "Maybe even what? Maybe even the chance to be loved for who I am, rather than despite who I am." Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "You deserve all of those things, Sarah, and more." They had reached the general store where Sarah lived. Henderson paused at the entrance, clearly reluctant to end their time together. "I'll be busy tomorrow," he said. "Meeting with some land agents, looking at properties. But I was hoping we might have dinner again Tuesday evening." "I'd like that," Sarah replied, meaning it completely. Henderson tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Sarah to climb the stairs to her room with her mind full of possibilities she'd never dared consider before. Monday brought a return to work at the ranch, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Buck Morrison and his crew had returned from their extended cattle drive, but their behavior was markedly different. Gone were the crude jokes and harassment. Instead, the ranch hands treated Sarah with careful politeness, as if she were made of fragile glass. "Morning, Miss Mitchell," Pete Hawkins said as she passed the bunkhouse, his tone respectful rather than mocking. Jake Reynolds actually removed his hat when he saw her, mumbling a greeting before hurrying away. The transformation was so complete that Sarah almost felt sorry for them. Their entire social hierarchy had been upended by Henderson's intervention. Mrs. Thornton seemed pleased by the new dynamic. "Much more civilized around here lately," she commented, as Sarah worked on some embroidery in the main house. "I should have brought in outside help months ago." The work itself had evolved as well. Sarah found herself spending more time on skilled needlework and less on menial chores. Mrs. Thornton had begun treating her more like a craftsperson than a servant, seeking her opinion on fabric choices and design decisions. "I'm having a dinner party next Friday," Mrs. Thornton announced casually. "Some of the county's leading families. I was hoping you might help me plan the table settings and perhaps do some special embroidery work for the linens." The request was significant beyond its practical aspects. By involving Sarah in planning a social event for the county's elite, Mrs. Thornton was signaling her elevated status within the household hierarchy. "Of course," Sarah replied. "I'd be honored to help." As the day progressed, Sarah became aware of increased activity around the ranch. Men she didn't recognize were riding in and out, conducting business with Mrs. Thornton that seemed to involve a great deal of paperwork and serious discussion. Buck Morrison appeared increasingly agitated by these developments. During lunch, Sarah overheard him talking to his crew in hushed but urgent tones. "Something's not right," Buck was saying. "All these strangers coming and going, asking questions about boundaries and water rights. And that Thornton woman's been acting like she's got some kind of ace up her sleeve. You think it's got something to do with Henderson?" Jimmy Sullivan asked nervously. "Everything around here's got something to do with Henderson lately," Buck replied grimly. "Man shows up, suddenly we're walking on eggshells, and that Mitchell girl's acting like she owns the place." Sarah felt a chill at the resentment in Buck's voice. Henderson's protection had improved her immediate circumstances, but it had also created new enemies. Men like Buck didn't forget humiliation easily, and they certainly didn't forgive it. That afternoon brought unexpected news. Henderson arrived at the ranch not alone, but accompanied by a well-dressed gentleman carrying surveying equipment. They spent several hours walking the property boundaries with Mrs. Thornton, examining fence lines and water sources with the methodical attention of people engaged in serious business negotiations. Sarah watched from the house as they conducted their survey, noting how Henderson moved across the landscape with the same careful awareness he displayed everywhere else. Even engaged in mundane business matters, he remained alert to his surroundings and potential threats. When the surveyor departed, Henderson approached the house where Sarah was working. "Busy day," he commented, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. "Seems like it. Is everything all right?" Henderson glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Mrs. Thornton and I are discussing a business arrangement. Nothing that should affect your position here, but changes might be coming to the ranch." Before Sarah could ask for clarification, Mrs. Thornton emerged from the house with a satisfied expression on her face. "Mr. Henderson, thank you for your time today. I believe this arrangement will benefit everyone involved." "My pleasure, ma'am. I'll have my attorney draw up the papers and send them to you for review." As Henderson prepared to leave, he turned to Sarah with a slight smile. "I haven't forgotten about tomorrow evening. Shall we say 7 o'clock? 7 o'clock, Sarah confirmed, aware that Mrs. Thornton was listening to every word of their exchange. After Henderson rode away, Mrs. Thornton studied Sarah with an unreadable expression. You and Mr. Henderson seem to be developing quite a friendship. Yes, ma'am. He's been very kind to me. He's a good man, Mrs. Thornton said thoughtfully, different from what his reputation might suggest. I think you'll find that association with him opens doors that might otherwise remain closed. That evening, as Sarah walked home to town, she reflected on the day's events. Whatever business arrangement Henderson and Mrs. Thornton were negotiating clearly involved significant changes to the ranch. And based on Mrs. Thornton's comments, those changes would likely benefit Sarah's position. But she also couldn't shake the memory of Buck Morrison's angry words. The ranch hands might be behaving respectfully now, but resentment was building beneath the surface. Henderson's protection was powerful, but it wasn't omnipresent. Eventually, Sarah would find herself in situations where she'd have to navigate these new dynamics on her own. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Sarah realized that her transformation was far from complete. The external changes, better treatment, social acceptance, romantic attention, were just the beginning. The real challenge would be developing the inner strength to maintain her new position without constant protection. Tomorrow's dinner with Henderson would be another step in that process. Each public appearance together solidified her status in the community, but it also raised the stakes for their relationship. People were watching, judging, calculating how to position themselves relative to this unlikely partnership. Sarah fell asleep that night thinking about possibilities and dangers, opportunities and obligations. Her old life of predictable hardship was gone forever, but the new life taking its place would require courage she wasn't certain she possessed. The next 24 hours would test that courage in ways she couldn't yet. Imagine Tuesday evening arrived with an unexpected autumn storm. Dark clouds had been gathering since afternoon, and by the time Sarah prepared for her dinner with Henderson, rain was drumming against her window with increasing intensity. She chose her outfit carefully, the green dress that had served her so well at the church dance, paired with a shawl Mrs. Murphy had insisted she borrow. The hotel's dining room provided welcome shelter from the weather. Henderson was already waiting when she arrived, rising from his chair with the courteous manner that had become familiar. But tonight, Sarah noticed something different in his demeanor, a tension that hadn't been present during their previous encounters. Rough weather, Henderson observed as they settled at their usual table by the window. Lightning illuminated the rain-soaked street outside, followed by thunder that rattled the hotel's windows. "I hope it doesn't interfere with your business meetings," Sarah said. Remembering his mention of property negotiations, Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. "Actually, the weather might be the least of my concerns regarding those meetings." Over dinner, Henderson revealed the details of his arrangement with Mrs. Thornton. He was purchasing a significant portion of the Broken Arrow Ranch, the eastern sections that included some of the best grazing, land and water rights in the county. The deal would make him one of the largest landowners in the territory, while providing Mrs. Thornton with the capital she needed to modernize her remaining operations. "It's a sound investment," Henderson explained, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision. "But it's also causing some tension in the community. Not everyone's happy about an outsider acquiring so much local property." Sarah understood immediately. In a place like Millbrook County, land ownership determined social and political power. Henderson's purchase would upset established hierarchies and create new dynamics that some people would resist. "What kind of tension?" she asked. "The kind that requires careful handling." "There's been talk at the saloon, meetings between some of the other ranchers. Nothing overt yet, but the undercurrents are getting stronger." Before Sarah could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Ben Crawford approached their table with the measured gait of a man trying to appear casual while conducting official business. "Evening, Henderson." "Miss Mitchell." Crawford was a weathered man in his 50s, competent enough at maintaining order in a peaceful community, but clearly out of his depth when dealing with someone of Henderson's reputation. "Sheriff," Henderson replied neutrally. "Join us for coffee." Crawford accepted the invitation but remained standing, his hand resting unconsciously near his gun belt. "I'll be direct, Henderson. There's been some complaints filed about your activities in the county." "What kind of complaints?" "Intimidation, threats of violence, disruption of lawful business operations." Crawford's voice carried the rehearsed quality of someone reciting charges he didn't fully understand. Henderson leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but alert. "Those are serious accusations, Sheriff. I assume you have evidence to support them?" "Well, no, not exactly. But there's been witnesses to—" "Witnesses to what specifically?" Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Henderson, I know your reputation, and I know you've got every right to conduct legitimate business in this county. But some folks are worried about what happens when men like you start putting down roots." Sarah watched this exchange with growing alarm. The sheriff's nervous energy and careful phrasing suggested he was being pressured by influential people to take action against Henderson. But Crawford was also clearly reluctant to escalate the situation with someone he couldn't handle. "Men like me," Henderson repeated quietly. "Well, what exactly does that mean, Sheriff?" "Gunfighters, professional killers, men who solve problems with violence." "I see. And what violence have I committed in your jurisdiction?" Crawford's frustration was becoming evident. "None yet. But—" "Then I suggest you focus on actual crimes rather than imaginary ones," Henderson interrupted, his tone still calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Because filing false charges against a citizen conducting lawful business might be considered harassment." The sheriff's face reddened, but he recognized the warning in Henderson's words. "Just keep things peaceful, Henderson. That's all I'm asking." After Crawford departed, Henderson sat in silence for several moments, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. Sarah could see him calculating possibilities, assessing threats, making the kind of strategic decisions that had kept him alive in a dangerous profession. "This is about more than land ownership, isn't it?" Sarah asked quietly. Henderson nodded slowly. "It's about power and respect. Some people in this county have gotten comfortable being the biggest fish in a small pond. My presence changes that dynamic. What will you do?" "What I always do. Stay alert, avoid unnecessary conflicts, but be ready for whatever comes." Henderson's eyes met hers across the table. "But I want you to understand something, Sarah. Association with me comes with risks. Tonight's visit from the sheriff is just the beginning." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Are you trying to discourage me from seeing you?" "I'm trying to make sure you understand the stakes. These aren't schoolyard bullies like Buck Morrison. These are powerful men who can make life difficult in ways you might not anticipate." The walk back to the general store was treacherous due to the storm, but Henderson insisted on escorting Sarah despite the weather. They moved carefully through puddles and mud, speaking little but acutely aware of each other's presence. At the store's entrance, Henderson paused under the narrow overhang that provided minimal protection from the rain. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "All right. Are you ready for the kind of attention our relationship is going to bring? Because after tonight, things are going to escalate. People are going to pressure you to end this association, and they won't all be as polite as Sheriff Crawford." Sarah looked up into Henderson's face, seeing there the same careful control he'd shown when facing down the ranch hands. But underneath that control, she glimpsed something else, genuine concern for her welfare. "I've spent my entire adult life being invisible," she said slowly, "being overlooked, dismissed, treated like I don't matter. For the first time, someone sees me as worthy of respect and protection. I'm not going to give that up because other people disapprove." Henderson smiled, the expression transforming his features despite the rain dripping from his hat brim. "That's what I hoped you'd say. But I needed to hear it from you." He kissed her then, gently but decisively, a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. When they separated, Sarah realized that this moment marked another threshold in her transformation. She was no longer just accepting Henderson's protection. She was choosing to stand with him despite the consequences. Wednesday brought immediate proof of Henderson's predictions. Sarah arrived at the ranch to find Mrs. Thornton in conference with her attorney, a nervous man named Pemberton who kept glancing toward the bunkhouse as if expecting trouble. "Shh, Sarah," Mrs. Thornton said as she entered the main house. "Perfect timing. Mr. Pemberton has some questions about the property survey from yesterday." The attorney looked uncomfortable discussing business in front of Sarah, but Mrs. Thornton's tone brooked no argument. "Miss Mitchell has my complete confidence, and she's likely to be affected by these arrangements." Over the next hour, Sarah learned that opposition to Henderson's land purchase was more organized than anyone had initially realized. A group of local ranchers, led by Harrison Blake, owner of the largest spread in the county, had been quietly building a coalition to block the sale. "They're claiming the survey markers were tampered with," Pemberton explained, his voice betraying his own skepticism about the charges, demanding a new survey be conducted by a court-appointed official. "That could delay the sale for months," Mrs. Thornton observed grimly. "Exactly their intention, I suspect." Blake's also filed a complaint with the territorial government, claiming Henderson's presence constitutes a threat to public safety. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. These were the same men who had ignored her existence when she was powerless, and now they were trying to destroy her chance at happiness out of petty jealousy and fear. "What can Henderson do?" she asked. "Legally, not much in the short term. But Henderson's reputation suggests he might not limit himself to legal remedies." Pemberton's nervousness was becoming more pronounced as he spoke. Mrs. Thornton's expression hardened. "Then perhaps it's time these gentlemen learned that they're not the only ones with influence in this territory." The meaning behind her words became clear over the next few days. Mrs. Thornton began calling in favors with merchants, bankers, and political figures throughout the region. Her late husband had been well connected, and she'd maintained those relationships through careful cultivation and generous support of various causes. By Friday, the tide had begun to turn. Judge Morrison, Pete Hawkins' uncle, and one of the few honest officials in the territorial government, announced that he would personally oversee any new property survey to ensure fairness and accuracy. The banker who held mortgages on several of Blake's properties suddenly became very interested in reviewing loan terms and payment schedules. But the opposition wasn't sitting idle. Harrison Blake had resources of his own, and he'd begun using them to pressure anyone associated with Henderson or the land deal. The attack came Saturday morning, swift and vicious in its precision. Sarah was hanging laundry behind the main house when Buck Morrison appeared with 3 of his crew. Their approach was casual enough to avoid attracting attention from the house, but their expressions carried malicious intent that made Sarah's blood run cold. Well, Buck said, his voice carrying the same mocking tone she remembered from her early days at the ranch. "If it isn't the princess herself." Sarah straightened slowly, her mind racing through possibilities for escape or assistance. The main house was 30 yards away, too far to reach before they could intercept her. The bunkhouse was closer, but it contained more potential enemies than allies. "Buck," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady, "what do you want?" "What I want is to have a little conversation about your boyfriend," Buck replied, moving closer with the predatory confidence of a man who knew he held all the advantages. "See, some of us think he's been getting a little too comfortable around here." Pete Hawkins spat tobacco juice near Sarah's feet, the gesture deliberately insulting. "Getting ideas above his station, you might say. And we think maybe he needs some encouragement to move along," added Jimmy Sullivan. His hand resting on the knife at his belt, Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't just harassment. It was a coordinated effort to send Henderson a message through her. Blake and his allies had decided that direct confrontation with Henderson was too dangerous, so they were targeting the one thing he'd shown he cared about protecting. "Henderson's not here," Sarah said, hoping to diffuse the situation through reason. "Whatever message you want to send him—" "Oh, we're not sending him a message," Buck interrupted with an ugly grin. "We're sending him a demonstration. They moved closer, forming a circle that cut off her retreat. Sarah's heart pounded as she recognized the cold calculation in their faces. These men had moved beyond simple cruelty into something far more dangerous. "You made us look like fools," Buck continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Bring in your gunfighter boyfriend to humble us in front of the whole county. Time you learned what happens to uppity girls who forget their place." Sarah backed against the clothesline, her hand closing around a wooden pin as the only available weapon. It wouldn't do much good against 4 men, but she refused to submit without a fight. "Mrs. Thornton will," she began. "Mrs. Thornton's in town for the day," Jake Reynolds said with satisfaction. "Won't be back until evening. Plenty of time for us to have our little talk and clean up any evidence." The implications of his words sent terror through Sarah's veins. This wasn't just about humiliation. They intended something much worse, something that would destroy her reputation and her relationship with Henderson in one brutal stroke. "You're making a mistake," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Henderson will kill you for this." "Henderson ain't gonna do nothing," Buck replied confidently, "because there won't be any proof of what happened here. Just your word against ours, and who's going to believe the testimony of a hysterical woman against 4 upstanding ranch hands?" They were close enough now that Sarah could smell whiskey on their breath and see the cruel anticipation in their eyes. She gripped the clothespin tighter, knowing it was useless, but needing something solid in her hand. Then she heard the sound that changed everything. Hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. Buck heard it too, his head snapping toward the sound with sudden alarm. The hoofbeats were too heavy, too fast for a casual visitor. Someone was riding hard toward the ranch, and there was only one person in the county who inspired that kind of urgency. Henderson appeared around the corner of the house like an avenging angel, his black stallion sliding to a stop in a spray of gravel and dust. His gun was already in his hand, though Sarah hadn't seen him draw it. "Step away from her," Henderson said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who'd been killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. The transformation in the ranch hands was instantaneous and complete. 4 dangerous men became 4 terrified boys in the space of a heartbeat. Buck's face went white, Pete actually whimpered, and Jimmy's hand moved carefully away from his knife. "Now, Henderson," Buck stammered, "this ain't what it looks like." "It looks like 4 men threatening a woman," Henderson replied coldly. "And unless you want to explain to the Undertaker why you thought that was a good idea, I suggest you start walking toward the bunkhouse slowly." They began to comply, but Henderson wasn't finished. "Buck," he called out, his voice stopping the foreman in his tracks. "If I ever see you within 50 feet of this woman again, I'll put a bullet in you without a second thought. And gentlemen," he addressed the other 3 without taking his eyes off Buck, "that goes for all of you." As the ranch hands stumbled away in defeat, Henderson holstered his gun and dismounted. He approached Sarah with the same careful movements he'd used when she was a wounded animal, his hands visible and unthreatening. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. Sarah realized she was shaking, the adrenaline and terror of the past few minutes finally catching up with her. "No, they didn't. You arrived in time." Henderson's jaw tightened as he took in the implications of what had almost happened. "This was planned. They knew Mrs. Thornton was gone, knew you'd be alone. Blake's people."
"Has to be."
"The timing's too convenient to be coincidence." Henderson's eyes swept the area around them, cataloging sightlines and potential ambush points with professional thoroughness. "Sarah, you can't stay here anymore. It's not safe, but my job, your job won't matter if you're dead. Or worse." The stark reality of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her carefully rebuilt life was crumbling again, but this time the stakes were far higher than simple employment or social standing. Her association with Henderson had made her a target for men who wouldn't hesitate to use violence to achieve their goals. "What do I do?" she asked, hating the helplessness in her own voice. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing options and consequences with the methodical care of a chess master planning several moves ahead. "Tomorrow's Sunday," he said finally. "After church, we're going to make an announcement that changes everything. But tonight, you're not staying alone above that store. You're coming to the hotel where I can keep you safe." As they rode toward town together, Sarah, on a gentle mare Henderson, had borrowed from Mrs. Thornton's stable, she realized that her transformation was entering its final phase. The shy, abused seamstress was about to disappear forever, replaced by something entirely new. Whatever Henderson planned to announce would seal her fate, for better or worse. And judging by the determined set of his jaw as they rode through the gathering dusk, it was going to shock everyone in Millbrook County. The Millbrook Hotel had never hosted such an arrangement. Henderson secured Sarah a room 2 doors down from his own suite, posting himself in the hallway between her door and the main staircase. Word of these unusual accommodations spread through town before midnight. Setting tongues wagging and assumptions flying, Sarah barely slept, her mind churning with questions about Henderson's planned announcement. The attack at the ranch had shattered any illusions about the genteel nature of the opposition they faced. These weren't just social snubs or business rivalries. These were men willing to commit serious crimes to maintain their power. Dawn brought unexpected visitors. Mrs. Thornton arrived at the hotel before 7 o'clock, accompanied by her attorney, and wearing an expression that could freeze summer rain. Her face was flushed with righteous anger, and her usual composure had been replaced by barely controlled fury. "Where is he?" she demanded of the desk clerk, who pointed nervously toward the dining room. Henderson was already dressed and finishing breakfast when Mrs. Thornton stormed in. Sarah, who had been picking at her own meal, watched as her employer approached their table with the determination of a general planning a siege. "Mr. Henderson," Mrs. Thornton said without preamble, "I've just learned what happened at my ranch yesterday. Those men will be terminated immediately. That's your decision to make," Henderson replied calmly, rising to offer her a chair. "But firing them won't solve the larger problem, which is, Blake and his allies aren't going to stop with intimidation. Yesterday was a test. They wanted to see how far they could push without consequences. When they discover that Sarah's under my protection at the hotel, they'll escalate again." Mrs. Thornton's jaw tightened. "Then perhaps it's time to remind Mr. Blake that he's not the only person in this county with resources and connections." Over the next hour, a remarkable coalition began to form in the hotel's dining room. Judge Morrison arrived first, followed by Dr. Whitman and banker Charles Abbott. Reverend Patterson appeared shortly after, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by grim determination. Sarah listened in amazement as these respected community leaders discussed strategy with the efficiency of military commanders. Mrs. Thornton had called in every favor, activated every alliance, and leveraged every business relationship to create a power base that could challenge Blake's traditional dominance. "The territorial governor owes me a significant favor," Judge Morrison reported. 3 letters of recommendation I provided for his son's appointment to West Point. He'll expedite approval of Henderson's land purchase and make it clear that any further legal challenges will be viewed unfavorably. Blake's cattle operation depends on railroad shipping contracts, Banker Abbott added. Contracts that come up for renewal next month. The railroad executives are personal friends of mine. Reverend Patterson, despite his calling, showed a surprisingly keen understanding of political warfare. Sunday service provides an excellent opportunity to address rumors and misinformation. A sermon about welcoming strangers and protecting the innocent should resonate with most of the congregation. Henderson watched these preparations with professional interest but growing concern. "I appreciate the support," he said carefully, "but escalating this conflict puts everyone at risk. Blake's already shown he's willing to use violence. Then we'll be ready for violence," Mrs. Thornton replied with steel in her voice. "I've sent word to my brother in Denver. He's bringing 20 men, former cavalry soldiers looking for work. They'll arrive by Tuesday. Sarah felt the situation spiraling beyond anything she could have imagined. Her simple desire for dignity and respect was triggering what amounted to a small war in Millbrook County. "There's another way," Henderson said suddenly. His tone, carrying the weight of a decision reached after careful consideration. "A way that settles this permanently, without bloodshed." All eyes turned toward him as he stood and walked to the window overlooking Main Street. The town was beginning to stir with Sunday morning activity, families preparing for church, merchants opening their shops, children playing in the dusty streets. "Blake's power comes from perception," Henderson continued. "People believe he's untouchable because he's always been the biggest force in the county. But perception can be changed in a single moment with the right demonstration." "What kind of demonstration?" Judge Morrison asked. Henderson turned back to face the group, his expression resolute. "The kind that makes it clear Sarah Mitchell isn't just under my protection. She's going to be my wife." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Sarah felt her heart stop, then begin racing as the implications crashed over her. Marriage to Henderson would change everything: her social status, her security, her entire future. "Cole," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. "Are you?" "I'm proposing," Henderson said simply, moving to kneel beside her chair. "Not because of the circumstances, though they make it urgent. Because I love you, and because I want to spend whatever time I have left in this world making you happy." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw not the calculated strategist who'd been planning their defense, but a man who'd found something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. The transformation in his expression mirrored her own journey, from powerless victim to someone worthy of love and protection. "Yes," she said quietly, then louder as confidence filled her voice. "Yes, I'll marry you." The dining room erupted in congratulations and excited planning. Mrs. Thornton immediately began discussing wedding arrangements. Judge Morrison offered to perform the ceremony, and Dr. Whitman volunteered his wife's assistance with preparations. But Henderson held up a hand for silence. "The wedding will be this afternoon, immediately after church service. Public ceremony, full congregation as witnesses." "This afternoon?" Mrs. Thornton looked startled. "That's impossibly short notice." "Sarah needs a proper dress, flowers, all the arrangements. The arrangements matter less than the timing," Henderson explained. "Blake's people need to understand that any action against Sarah is now an action against my wife. The legal and social implications of that change everything." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "A wife has protections under territorial law that a girlfriend doesn't, and attacking a married woman carries much harsher penalties than intimidating a single girl." "Exactly. And the public nature of the ceremony eliminates any possibility of denying the relationship or claiming it's temporary." Sarah's head was spinning with the rapid pace of developments, but she recognized the strategic brilliance of Henderson's plan. By making their relationship legally and socially official, he was forcing Blake and his allies to either accept defeat or escalate to open warfare against a united community. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Mrs. Thornton dispatched her household staff to prepare Sarah for the ceremony, while the men coordinated security arrangements and guest notifications. Word of the impending wedding spread through Millbrook like wildfire, with reactions ranging from excitement to outrage, depending on the listeners' loyalties. Sarah found herself in Mrs. Thornton's private chambers, surrounded by women who had previously treated her as invisible. Victoria Thornton had returned from Kansas City specifically for the wedding, bringing with her a trunk full of appropriate accessories. The banker's wife contributed jewelry, the doctor's wife provided perfume, and even Mrs. Murphy appeared with a family heirloom, a pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. "Every bride needs something borrowed," Mrs. Murphy declared, fastening the necklace around Sarah's throat with gentle care. The dress was Victoria's contribution, a creation of ivory silk that had been intended for her. own future wedding, but fit Sarah perfectly after quick alterations. The style was elegant without being ostentatious, appropriate for both the religious ceremony and the political statement it represented. As Sarah studied herself in Mrs. Thornton's full-length mirror, she marveled at the transformation. The frightened girl who'd arrived at the ranch in a flour-sack dress was gone, replaced by a confident woman who looked every inch the bride of a successful landowner. "You're beautiful," Victoria said softly, her voice carrying genuine warmth rather than the polite distance Sarah had expected. "Cole Henderson is a lucky man." Meanwhile, across town, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Harrison Blake had called an emergency meeting of his allies at his ranch, and the discussion was heated and desperate. "We can't let this happen," Blake declared, pacing before a group of grim-faced men. "If Henderson marries that girl, it legitimizes his position here permanently. We lose any chance of forcing him out. What do you suggest?" asked cattle baron Robert Crenshaw, whose own operations had been affected by Henderson's land purchase. "Storm the church. That would bring the territorial government down on us." "There are other ways to disrupt a wedding," Blake replied darkly. "Ways that look like accidents or coincidences, but even Blake's most loyal supporters seemed reluctant to escalate to that level of direct confrontation. Intimidating a powerless seamstress was one thing. Interfering with a public wedding ceremony involving some of the county's most prominent citizens was quite another. The debate continued until one of Blake's men burst into the room with alarming news. "Boss, you need to see this. There's armed men riding into town from the north. 20 of them, all carrying military rifles. Mrs. Thornton's brother had arrived early, bringing the promised reinforcements. The former cavalry soldiers took up positions around the church and hotel with professional efficiency, their presence sending a clear message about the community's commitment to protecting the wedding." Blake realized his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Any action now would require open warfare against superior forces, with uncertain support from his own men and the territorial government already predisposed against him. As Sunday afternoon arrived, Millbrook's church filled with an unprecedented congregation. Citizens who rarely attended services appeared in their finest clothes, drawn by curiosity about the most talked-about wedding in the county's history. Henderson waited at the altar in a black suit that emphasized his commanding presence. While Judge Morrison prepared to perform the ceremony with obvious satisfaction, Sarah's entrance was everything Henderson had hoped for, a public demonstration of transformation that silenced whispers and commanded respect. She walked down the aisle alone, having no father to give her away, but her bearing was so confident and elegant that the absence seemed like a choice rather than a lack. The ceremony itself was brief but powerful. Henderson's vows were simple and heartfelt, promising protection, love, and partnership. Sarah's response carried the strength of a woman who had finally found her place in the world. "You may kiss your bride," Judge Morrison announced with barely concealed pleasure. Henderson's kiss was gentle but thorough, a gesture that sealed their legal bond while sending an unmistakable message to anyone who might still harbor thoughts of interference. As the couple turned to face the congregation, Sarah saw faces that ranged from genuine joy to grudging acceptance to barely concealed frustration. But she also saw something else: recognition. For the first time in her adult life, people were looking at her not as a charity case or an object of scorn, but as someone who mattered. The reception at the hotel was a celebration that transformed into a political rally. Speaker after speaker rose to toast the new couple while making pointed comments about community values, welcoming newcomers and protecting the innocent. Mrs. Thornton's speech was particularly pointed, describing Henderson as exactly the kind of citizen Millbrook County needed: strong, honorable, and committed to building rather than destroying. But the real impact of the wedding became clear when Buck Morrison and his crew appeared on Main Street during the reception. They'd clearly been drinking, and their presence was obviously intended as some form of intimidation or disruption. Henderson excused himself from the reception and walked out to meet them, Sarah at his side. The symbolism was powerful, the newlyweds presenting a united front against the forces that had terrorized her just days before. "Congratulations," Buck said with exaggerated politeness that fooled no one. "Heard you got yourself hitched." "That's right," Henderson replied evenly. "Mrs. Henderson and I are very happy." The use of Sarah's new title was deliberate and effective. Buck's expression flickered with recognition that the situation had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just Henderson protecting a vulnerable girl anymore. This was a husband defending his wife, with all the legal and social implications that entailed. "Well," Buck said after a long pause, "guess that changes things." "It does," Henderson agreed. "Considerably." Buck nodded slowly, his gaze moving between Henderson and Sarah with calculation that was visible to everyone watching. Then, without another word, he turned and led his men away from the hotel. The confrontation was over in minutes, but its significance was enormous. By backing down publicly, Buck had acknowledged Henderson's victory and Sarah's new status. Word of the encounter would spread quickly, cementing the new power structure in the county. As evening fell and the reception wound down, Sarah found herself standing on the hotel's balcony with her new husband, looking out over the town that had finally accepted her as one of its own. "Any regrets?" Henderson asked quietly. Sarah considered the question seriously. Her old life had been predictable in its hardship, while her new life promised challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But it also promised love, respect, and the chance to be seen as someone who mattered. "None," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I want to be." Henderson smiled and pulled her closer as the first stars appeared in the clear autumn sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Blake and his allies regrouped and planned their next move. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell Henderson was exactly where she belonged, beside the man who had seen her worth when no one else would, in the community that finally recognized her as someone deserving of respect and protection. The transformation was complete, but the real adventure was just beginning. 2 weeks after the wedding, Sarah Henderson stood on the porch of her new home, watching the sunrise paint the eastern pastures gold. The house Henderson had built on his newly acquired land was modest but substantial, 2 stories of solid timber with windows that caught the morning light and a wide porch that offered views of the rolling countryside. The transformation of her daily existence was profound. Where she'd once woken in a cramped room above a general store, wondering if she'd have enough money for breakfast, she now woke in a comfortable bedroom beside a husband who treated her as if she were precious beyond measure. The constant anxiety that had defined her life for months had been replaced by a sense of security she'd never experienced. But the changes extended far beyond personal comfort. The social dynamics of Millbrook County had shifted dramatically in the wake of the wedding, creating new alliances and revealing character in ways that surprised everyone involved. Harrison Blake had made one final attempt to challenge Henderson's position, filing formal complaints with the territorial governor about undesirable elements threatening the stability of the region. The response had been swift and decisive. A letter from the governor's office not only dismissing Blake's concerns, but also announcing an investigation into certain irregularities in cattle branding practices and land boundary disputes. Within days, Blake found himself facing the same kind of legal scrutiny he'd tried to impose on Henderson. His allies began distancing themselves as their own business practices came under examination, and his influence in the county started to crumble like sand. The collapse of Blake's power structure created opportunities for new leadership to emerge. Mrs. Thornton, energized by her successful alliance with Henderson, had begun organizing the county's first Women's Improvement Society. Dr. Whitman was spearheading efforts to establish a proper school system. Judge Morrison was working to bring additional law enforcement to the territory. Sarah found herself at the center of these developments, her opinions sought and valued by the same people who had previously ignored her existence. The irony wasn't lost on her. The girl who'd been denied entry to polite society was now helping to shape its future. Direction. Her role in the community was formalized when Reverend Patterson approached her about organizing the church's charity efforts. The previous winter's hardships had left several families struggling, and Sarah's own experience with poverty made her uniquely qualified to identify genuine need and effective assistance. "You understand what it means to have nothing?" the Reverend explained as they discussed plans in the church parlor. "That gives you insight the rest of us lack." The work was challenging but deeply satisfying. Sarah coordinated food distribution, organized clothing drives, and helped establish a small lending library that would give children access to books their families couldn't afford to purchase. Each project reinforced her new social position while allowing her to help others in situations similar to her former circumstances. Henderson, meanwhile, was proving himself a capable rancher and savvy businessman. His approach to cattle management was more systematic than traditional methods, incorporating techniques he'd observed during his travels. The eastern section of the former Broken Arrow Ranch was becoming more profitable under his management than it had ever been under Mrs. Thornton's oversight. More importantly, he was earning genuine respect from the working men of the county. Unlike Blake, who ruled through intimidation and economic pressure, Henderson led by example. He worked alongside his hired hands, paid fair wages, and treated everyone with basic dignity, regardless of their social standing. The contrast became evident when Henderson needed additional workers for the autumn cattle drive. Men who had previously been loyal to Blake's operation began seeking employment at the Henderson Ranch. Drawn by reports of better working conditions and honest dealing, Buck Morrison was not among them. The former Broken Arrow foreman had left Millbrook County entirely, taking Pete Hawkins and Jake Reynolds with him. Jimmy Sullivan had stayed, but found work at a small operation on the far side of the county, well away from Henderson's influence. The dissolution of their group marked the end of an era of casual cruelty that had defined ranch life for years. Tom Bradley, the ranch hand with the scarred face, had surprised everyone by approaching Henderson directly to request employment. "I ain't proud of what we'd done to your wife," he'd said, hat in hand and eyes downcast. "But I need work, and I hear you pay fair." Henderson had studied the man for a long moment before responding. "Can you follow orders without question?" "Yes, sir. Can you treat everyone on this ranch with respect, regardless of their position?" "Yes, sir. Then you can start Monday. But understand this, any disrespect toward Mrs. Henderson or anyone else, and you'll be gone the same day." Tom had proved to be one of Henderson's most reliable workers, his gratitude for the second chance translating into fierce loyalty and competent labor. The transformation demonstrated Henderson's belief that most men could change given proper motivation and leadership. Sarah had been nervous about Tom's employment initially, but Henderson's confidence in his own judgment proved well-founded. The scarred ranch hand was invariably polite during their infrequent interactions, his deference bordering on the excessive as he struggled to atone for his past behavior. The incident that truly tested the new social order came in November, when Victoria Thornton became engaged to Marcus Abbott, the banker's son. The announcement was expected and welcomed, but the engagement party created an unprecedented social situation. Sarah Henderson, as a prominent ranch owner's wife, would normally be included in such elite gatherings. But her recent elevation from servant status created delicate questions of protocol that no one was quite sure how to navigate. Mrs. Thornton resolved the dilemma in characteristic fashion by making Sarah the guest of honors, advisor on wedding preparations. "Victoria specifically requested your assistance," Mrs. Thornton announced during a visit to the Henderson Ranch. "Your experience with wedding planning under challenging circumstances makes you uniquely qualified to help her navigate the complexities." The request was both genuine and strategic. Victoria truly did want Sarah's help, having developed genuine affection for her during the whirlwind preparations for Sarah's own wedding. But Mrs. Thornton also recognized that publicly acknowledging Sarah's expertise would further cement her social position. The engagement party became a triumph for Sarah in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her suggestions for decorations were implemented enthusiastically. Her opinions on catering were sought and valued, and her presence was welcomed by guests who had once looked through her as if she were invisible. Judge Morrison's wife made a point of introducing Sarah to visiting dignitaries from the territorial capital, describing her as one of our community's most valued residents. Banker Abbott sought her advice on economic development initiatives, recognizing that her husband's success was contributing significantly to the county's prosperity. Most satisfying was the reaction of the handful of Blake loyalists who still attended community events. Their forced politeness and obvious discomfort provided sweet vindication for years of humiliation and dismissal. But the evening's most meaningful moment came when Victoria Thornton pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said quietly. "Before all this began, I barely noticed you existed. I'm ashamed of that now. You don't need to apologize," Sarah replied graciously. "We were different people then, living in different worlds. That's no excuse for basic kindness. You were working in our home, helping our family, and I treated you like furniture." Victoria's voice carried genuine remorse. "I want you to know that I've learned something important from watching your transformation." "What's that?" "That a person's worth has nothing to do with their circumstances. You were always remarkable. I was just too blind to see it." The conversation marked Sarah's complete acceptance into the social circle she'd once served from the margins. No longer was she Henderson's wife being tolerated for his sake. She was valued for her own contributions and character. Winter brought new challenges that tested the solidarity of Henderson's supporters. A harsh blizzard in December stranded several families, and the coordinated relief effort became a demonstration of the new community spirit that had emerged since Henderson's arrival. Sarah organized food distribution from the church, while Henderson provided shelter for stranded travelers at his ranch. Mrs. Thornton opened her main house to families whose homes had suffered damage, and Dr. Whitman worked tirelessly to treat injuries and illnesses caused by the extreme weather. The contrast with previous winters was stark. In past years, each family had struggled independently, with help coming only to those who could afford to pay for it. The organized community response saved lives and prevented the kind of devastating losses that had historically accompanied severe weather. Blake, observing these developments from his diminished position, made one final attempt to reassert his influence. He began spreading rumors that Henderson's success was built on illegal activities, gun running, claim jumping, association with known outlaws. The rumors might have gained traction in the past, when Blake's word carried significant weight, but the community's experience with Henderson had provided its own evidence of his character. The rumors were dismissed as quickly as they spread, and Blake's credibility suffered further damage. Spring brought the final resolution to the conflict that had defined Sarah's transformation. Blake, facing mounting legal troubles and social isolation, announced his intention to sell his holdings and relocate to California. The departure of Henderson's primary antagonist marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase of community development. Henderson purchased several of Blake's properties at auction, consolidating his position as the county's largest landowner. But unlike Blake, who had used his holdings to dominate others, Henderson immediately began plans for development that would benefit the entire community. He announced the establishment of a grain mill that would provide farmers with local processing capabilities. He pledged to support the construction of a railroad spur that would improve shipping access for all area ranchers. Most significantly, he donated land for the expansion of the county's school system, Sarah played a central role in these initiatives, her organizational skills and community connections proving invaluable. The girl who had once been grateful for any employment was now helping to shape the economic future of an entire region. The first anniversary of their wedding was celebrated with a community festival that drew visitors from throughout the territory. The event showcased the prosperity and harmony that had developed under the new leadership, with exhibits of local crafts, agricultural products, and business innovations. Sarah stood with Henderson on the platform as Judge Morrison addressed the assembled crowd, reflecting on the changes that had transformed their community. A year ago, she had been invisible to most of these people. Now she was recognized as one of the county's most influential citizens. This community has always had good people, the judge declared, but it took new leadership to bring out the best in everyone. Cole and Sarah Henderson have shown us what's possible when we work together instead of against each other. The applause that followed felt like vindication for every humiliation Sarah had endured, every moment of despair she had overcome. But more than that, it felt like recognition of who she had always been inside, someone worthy of respect, love, and influence. As the festival continued into the evening, Henderson and Sarah walked through the crowd, greeting friends and neighbors who had become genuine supporters rather than reluctant acquaintances. Children who had been taught to show proper respect to their elders now approached Sarah with easy familiarity, seeking her advice on school projects or sharing exciting news about their families. The transformation was complete, but Sarah understood that it hadn't been magic. It had been the result of courage, Henderson's courage in defending her, her own courage in accepting his protection and building on it, and the community's courage in embracing change over comfortable prejudice. That night, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the clear spring sky, Henderson took Sarah's hand in his. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question from their wedding night. Sarah considered everything that had changed: the security, the respect, the opportunities to help others, the love that had transformed her understanding of what life could offer. "Just one," she said finally. Henderson looked surprised. "What's that?" "I regret that it took so long for me to believe I deserved all of this." Henderson smiled, the expression that had first hinted at the man behind the reputation. "Then we'll spend the rest of our lives making sure you never doubt it again." The ranch hands who had once mocked her torn dress were long gone, scattered to distant territories where their brand of casual cruelty might still find tolerance. Sarah Henderson, respected citizen and beloved wife, had indeed ridden into town beside the cowboy they had feared and loved. But her true victory wasn't in their departure or defeat. It was in the discovery that she had always possessed the strength and dignity they had tried to destroy. Henderson hadn't created her worth. He had simply been the first person with the wisdom to recognize it. As the years passed, Sarah's story would become legend in Millbrook County. Children would grow up hearing about the seamstress who became a lady, the outcast who became a leader, the woman who proved that circumstances don't define character. But Sarah herself understood that the real story wasn't about transformation at all. It was about recognition, the moment when someone finally saw her clearly and the courage to let herself be seen. The mockery had ended. The respect had begun, and Sarah Henderson had found her place in a world that finally understood her value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.